Namaskara, good evening, and welcome to BIC Streams. Bangalore International Center, or BIC for short, is an inclusive and neutral platform for informed conversation, intellectual dialogue, exchange of ideas, arts, and culture. Today's session is Staying Poor in a Rich City, Slums and Informal Work in Bangalore. Global cities are epicenters of rapid advances in technology and trade, wealth and power, upwardly mobile professional classes, keyed into global concepts of living and luxury. This 21st century glitter is often overshadowed by the stubbornness of poverty in cities, which continues to keep alive discussions on making growth equitable. This discussion, based on Supriya Roy Chowdhury's new book, City of Shadows, Slums and Informal Work in Bangalore, which presents research on what happens to the poor in an economically vibrant and rapidly growing city like Bangalore. Is it a question of time and individual effort before they shift out of poverty, or are there deeply structural features relating to political economy and policy that bind the slum communities and working classes to a tough future? How do we think of democracy and the political agency of the poor in this context? These questions and more will be addressed by our panelists. On the panel today, we have Lalita Kamath, Urbanist, Center for Urban Policy and Governance, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Alessandra Mesadri, Senior Lecturer in Development Science Studies, School of Oriental and African Studies, Anirudh Krishna, Edgar T. Thompson Professor of Public Policy and Political Science, Duke University, and of course, Supriya Roy Chowdhury, Visiting Professor, National Institute of Advanced Studies. The panel is moderated by Chandan Gowda, the Ramakrishna Hegde Chair, Professor of Decentralization and Development, Institute for Social and Economic Change. The full bios of the speakers will appear in the chat box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And through the session, if you have any questions, comments, or observations to share, please feel free to use the Q&A box, which is next to the chat box, also at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And the speakers will get to it towards the end of the session. And with that, I invite Chandan to take over.
Thank you, Lekha. Thank you to BIC for hosting this panel discussion on Supriya Roy Chowdhury's new book, just published, City of Shadows, Slums and Informal Work in Bangalore. This is based on many years of research she did while she was in the Institute for Social and Economic Change. She's recently moved to NIAS. We're also fortunate to have terrific panelists who have worked in this field. Two of them actually appear in the book, in Supriya's very tightly laid out map of names and issues. Bangalore has officially recognized slums, that number over 16 and over 520, sorry, and about 16% of Bangalore's population officially is known to live inside them. But rarely do these people or places, command the kind of attention they ought to. I mean, there's this rough sort of unstated presumption that somehow things will percolate down and they'll all be okay somehow. Supriya's book actually tries to argue against any such naive presumptions or complacent presumptions people might have about how slums might fare given time. The field work has happened in Bangalore, and she will give us a sense for that soon. But the research questions and the theoretical engagement isn't limited to the realities of Bangalore slums, as they unfold here. I mean, there's an interest in engaging with how informality has been discussed in social science literature, and of course, an engagement with a very grand question of class formation, the nature of the proletariat class, assumed to have a fairly clear existence as an object, political object, but the book tries to tell us that it's far more heterogeneous and complex. So there's a theoretical discussion of a very rich kind, of a very elaborate kind on informality and capitalism via an engagement with slums. And there's also meso level questions, in terms of what politics is like in the slums, what happens to informal sort of laborers in the women's garments factory, etc. I won't. So anyway, this book, addressed to an academic audience, but I think has a very should have great appeal to anyone interested in the city of Bangalore, and more broadly how the realities of labor and culture are, not culture, politics and economy rather, are being shaped around us. We'll first have Supriya tell us a little bit about how the book came about and what she would like the readers to walk away with after having read the book. And then we'll have the panelists respond to her in about 8 to 10 minutes. And then we'll have Supriya respond to them, and there will be a discussion with the audience for the remainder of the time. So Supriya.
Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking the Bangalore International Center for hosting this event. And also, I could not have hoped for a more meaningful panel because as I have researched on cities, I have learned from the work that each of you, all four of you, have actually done on cities, whether it's labor, culture, institutions, or governance. But Chandan has actually given me very little time, like 5 to 6 minutes. So let me just highlight a few things about the book. The first being that, research on this book started many years back when during my stay at ISEC, and 3 successive research projects, one on globalization and India and the Indian state, the other on migration, which the Karnataka government wanted us to do, and finally a study on service sector employment in Bangalore. This book is based on the findings of these projects and of several other smaller projects which ISEC enabled me to do from seed funding. What these studies facilitated was a close engagement with Bangalore slums over many years. And I had, successively very, very good teams of researchers working with me. We were able to conduct some surveys of work, employment, and income, as well as hold qualitative discussions. We spent long hours over several days and weeks in each of the slums which have been written about in the book, doing the surveys, holding discussions with household members, youth, slum leaders, NGOs working in the slums, Anganwadi teachers, and so on. It was a very, very rich resource from which to draw on. Results of the surveys were often checked with slum households themselves, so it was kind of a reciprocal learning relationship which we had set up. And most importantly, we could go back to update the data because the research was done over several years. Similarly, for the ready-made garments, a global supply chain industry, which I have been tracking now for almost 15 years, we were not allowed to go inside the factories, but many meetings in the neighborhoods where they live, again, over many years, in the union offices and so on, enabled us to get a grasp of this sector. Now, a single case study is interesting in itself, perhaps, would be interesting for those who are interested in Bangalore, so on and so forth. But to me, it would be interesting more for the broader comparative questions that it raises in the current context. And I'd just like to say that the dramatic wealth generation in the latter half of the 20th and the first half of the 21st century, which has happened, these gains have been most prominently in large cities, global cities particularly, which have moved almost to a different universe in terms of scales of consumption, connectivity, splendor, etc. And yet stubborn and very deep pockets of poverty exist in these cities. Globally, 900 million now live in slums. And if you add other informal settlements, the number is about 1.6 billion, or 1/4 of the urban population in the world live in slums. Now, so this whole phenomenon of urban poverty in the current context can be and has been looked at in different ways. One being that the marginalization of particular social groups, caste, race, gender, who have suffered historically long-standing disadvantages. That's one way of cutting into it, which many have done. Alternatively, slums have been seen as spaces of marginalization, which have remained excluded from state attention, civic amenities, education and health, and other resources. These are, intersecting axes. So the spatial isolation of Dalits, for example, in cities, in slums, coincides with their exclusion from civic amenities like housing, water, schools, health centers, etc. My book is predominantly about work, income, and livelihoods. And I actually deploy a broadly political economy analytical framework. With the decline of state-owned industries, small-scale sector industries, and labor-intensive industries like textiles, factory or manufacturing sector jobs were, from the mid-1980s onwards, were no longer available to unskilled or semi-skilled persons from slums or from migrant communities. So the city's growth in the last 3 decades in Bangalore has really been based on IT and ITES, financial services, knowledge and capital intensive industries driven by private capital, both domestic and foreign. So it's actually a different paradigm of growth and a different kind of prosperity, one earlier which had been led by the public sector, now which is being led by the private sector driven technology-led industries. And as industry and services became technology and capital intensive, the question of employment of unskilled and semi-skilled workers became a blind spot in policy. So what then does the urban underclass do for a living? Spatially and conceptually, the poor in the city are seen in 2 categories. The first are what I have called the new poor, who have lived in the city anywhere between 0 to 20 years. They are crowded into the construction sector as unskilled labor with low pay and uncertain work. And they live in fragile, unserviced tenements in the city's peripheries or in labor camps set up by construction companies. The second category are what I have called the old poor, slums in the city's inner city neighborhoods. And we looked at Lal Bagh, where slums are 50 to 70 years old. So there's a contrast between the new slums and the old slums. Many, in fact, a large number of households in these older slums in the inner city areas remain confined to traditional low-income occupations, construction, headload bearing, street side selling, rag picking, road cleaning, and so on. They constitute what I have termed the old poor, live in old slums for 2-3 generations, unable to access the dynamism of the city's growing economy. However, it should be noted, and we did find that the situation is actually much more complex than this picture, because there are some households in each of these slums who have been able to make the transition to jobs in the new services sector or in global supply chain garments exports. So there are, in fact, channels of inclusion as well as channels of exclusion. And one agenda of the book was to explore both. Why are some households included while others are excluded? But whether in manufacturing or in services, most of employment is in the informal sector with unregulated wages, no written contracts, no security for tenure or social insurance. So informality actually provides the broad conceptual framework within which I have looked at these occupations across manufacturing and services, older and newer kinds of occupations that are available. And we can come back to a discussion of informality at a later stage. But very briefly, and I'm going to end soon, what is new about these findings? There are some dominant strands of thinking on urban poverty. The World Bank and other similar institutions have consistently held that urban poverty is a spillover of rural poverty. Briefly, that those who move to cities, all of them cannot readily take advantage of urban opportunities. Some fall back, and the poverty and squalor we see in cities is a carryover of rural poverty. On this view, then it is only a matter of time before they shift out of poverty. This mainstream perspective is actually challenged by the story of the old poor, that is, those who have lived in slums for 2 to 3 generations and unable to take advantage of urban opportunities. We looked at a slum called Cement Huts, which is in the Lal Bagh area, which is about 70 to 80 years old now, and where 90% of the households are actually engaged in rag picking at very, very low levels of activities, very low incomes and returns to their labor. So it kind of shows that there has been no interventions from the state into the slum, nor has organized garbage collection, which is practiced in the city in some areas, been able to make any kind of difference to rag pickers in the city. Secondly, coming to migrants, they appear in the book in the city's peripheral slums, that is in the outskirts. Much of this population is crowded into the construction industry as unskilled labor. And while earlier this population was mostly from North Karnataka, we now have, they're all from all over, UP, Rajasthan, West Bengal, Jharkhand, etc. This population remains circular. Migrant males who have left their families behind remain circulatory for many years, sometimes for close to or over 20 years. They derive part of their sustenance from the village of origin. Now, I think it's really important to understand these are not cases of urban workers investing in land in their village of origin, making a decent income, or returning to their villages short breaks. These are households which have continued dependence on the rural economy as labor during harvest season or in multiple activities that they resort to when work becomes unavailable or the city becomes too harsh during illness or pandemic. So the pandemic, of course, brought the migrant situation to the surface, but I think it's really important to note that this fragility, which we saw in migrant lives, is structured into the political economy of urbanization. And scholars have actually noted for a long time, from Bremen's footloose workers, more recently to a British anthropologist's conceptualization, that these workers are neither rural nor urban. So in a sense, this in-between existence of millions of households brings into question that the model of urbanization that we are pursuing is probably very different from the hegemonic understanding of urbanization as development. In my book, broadly, the marginalization of both the old poor and the new poor is traced not only to the model of development that has been pursued in Karnataka and India broadly, which is not employment friendly, but crucially to informal work and the precarity that goes with it. Informality is a very complex concept and is associated with positive things like flexibility, efficiency, so on and so forth. But it relates basically to unregulated work in this context, where wages may fall below stipulated minimum with no security of life. But informality is actually also broader than these work-related issues. It extends to informal housing, illegal electricity connections, irregular access to water, sanitation, so on and so forth. So finally, the question of political agency of the poor, broadly or informal workers more specifically, is really of critical importance. Because the way the poor have been organized is through the idea of multiple civil society organizations, supporting the urban underclass for a variety of issues to press their claims on the state. This book raises the question of political agency of the poor as informal workers. Can we use the concept of informality as an overarching umbrella-like framework to think of urban underprivileged workers? And what are the mechanisms of organization and collective action that may be available to them? So to theorize the political agency of informal workers as workers is a huge challenge for both theorists and activists, as we all know, but we could come back to these questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Supriya. Thank you. That was helpful introduction to the book. So we'll have the panelists respond to your book. We'll go in the order in which their names appear in the program. Lalita Kamath.
Sure.
Yes.
First of all, it's a great pleasure. It's an honor to be here and to be part of this wonderful panel. And first off, let me say, Supriya, congratulations on this tremendous achievement. And I'm not talking here only about the book, but I'm just talking about the many, many years of, I think, very dedicated and rigorous scholarship. So this is really something that I wanted to begin saying. For me, the key contribution of the book has really been that it has returned the policy and academic focus back to wage and employment, where there has been far too little attention for far too long a time. So that is really something that I wanted to say up front. Today, I wanted to actually raise 3 points. The first is in terms of the kind of insights that the book holds in the relationship between space, economy, and politics of the city. And this is at 2 levels. So firstly, at the level of the locality, the book describes and analyzes how economies are embedded in particular spaces. Diverse slums, particular work opportunities available in different geographies of the city, and how these interactions shape then the character of different industries, work, and also then the constraints and the opportunities to make different kinds of claims on city resources. So the book's focus on specificities of place and work as socially and spatially embedded is an important contribution. It is also a call, I think, to expand this arena of work. We know far too little, I think, about neighborhood-based economies and histories of settlement, of living and working. At a second level, the book has tremendous insights about the city as a whole through its economy. So it talks about the turn towards IT and ready-made garments since the mid-80s, in a sense, 2 major planks or twin planks of the economy, but the relative invisibility of the latter vis-a-vis the almost hyper visibility of the former. And this is also a spatial divide, a gap between, where you see IT concentrated more in the eastern part of the city and garments more in the western parts. This also is another set of divides that affords greater invisibility to poorer employment practices. And you talk about the powerlessness of its women workforce, a core part of the city's economy. So the book's focus then on the city as a whole, and over time, this longer historical arc that then tracks the old poor and the new poor is again a really important contribution at a time when many case studies in fact focus on snapshots in time of particular projects or sectors or settlements. The second point that I want to make is really one about policy. And I want to really ask, what kind of policy lessons does this kind of fine-grained research you've done in the book reveal that we can take advantage of in this particular COVID moment that we find ourselves in? Let me talk first about some of the policy lessons I think the book highlights. First of all, it indicts the state for not placing employment and wages on the policy agenda, but focusing on a far more limited set of welfare provisions, primarily housing and associated services. Even here, in this narrow kind of focus, even here it highlights the ineffectiveness of government policies in terms of, you name it, reach, adequacy, quality, appropriateness. Probably the most, the biggest, sort of the most eloquent testimony here is the widespread refusal of poor communities to relocate to government-built housing or allow their slum to be redeveloped. And this, in fact, then just reveals the major disconnects between the living, working needs of poor groups and what the state provides. And this really hinges, it turns on the demand for land rights, as you point out, which poor communities make and which the state almost consistently denies. The book also examines both physical and social infrastructure. So physical infrastructure here largely is in the realm of integrated housing and services, and social infrastructure is most typically understood as education and health. And so what the book does is it also examines both components in different slums. And I think, and notes the importance of focusing on both. This is very rarely done. So this is again something that I think is useful. I'm commenting here as an urban planner, and I can say with some degree of confidence that in my training and in typical practice of planning, you largely focus on spatial and physical infrastructure, spatial land use and physical infrastructure. You rarely think about things like public health. And the pandemic, I think, has really reinforced the need to think about public health within planning. The book's attention also to the economic and spatial dimensions of migration and work reveal then also the huge diversity within and across slums and sectors. And this, I think, very clearly pointed out is a landscape of graded vulnerabilities. And this landscape of graded vulnerabilities has implications for how poverty is experienced and the differentiation needed in policies formulated, whereas our policies tend to be one size fits all, as you point out. So overall, in terms of policy, the book represents a very powerful call for making the informal sector central to reimagining welfare and social protection, making wages, income, and housing central to redistributive concerns. And this couldn't be more relevant than in the time of the pandemic and the first national and now series of localized lockdowns we face. During the pandemic, we are in fact learning that where we had some systems for social welfare, we could build on them to provide more effective relief. Therefore, we did better in food relief than we did in wage transfers. And housing or rent support was practically not achieved at all because it isn't considered part of the necessary basket of social protection. So can the finely grained research in this book actually highlight for us how policy gaps and disconnects can be turned into a more effective social protection system for informal workers? And these could be both income-based, such as something like a ration card, but also place-based. And I think your book has insights on both these dimensions. The final point I wanted to make, the book highlights the existence and suffering of a large underclass. It forces our attention to the structural processes by which this class gets formed and reformed, using wages and income as the central pivot to understanding this. It therefore contributes to ongoing debates on the structural nature of violence, of racism, and environmental injustices faced by marginalized groups. This requires thinking of the intersectional impact of spatial, labor, and environmental inequalities in Indian cities, as well as the causal pathways and mechanisms of these inequalities. But the focus on structural processes also means it's difficult to pin agency and accountability on any single actor. So this raises the question in turn of, from whom do we seek redress? Where do we look to for accountability? The book indeed asks this. It asks how much can we rely on popular empowerment through political society, through new trade unions, especially in this new dispensation where the state is very tightly interwoven with capital, where politicians are more interested in real estate development than they are in the welfare of their constituents. But the book also provides clues here as to possible answers to this thorny question, in the argument that the state structures the informality that commonly affects workers across slums and sectors of work. So this locates causality in the state apparatus through informality. In work I have done with other colleagues, I have in fact argued for greater attention to how governance is being reworked in the contemporary moment, how the state performs ambivalent governance, as we call it, the simultaneously strong and weak faces of the state to fragment and divide worker solidarities. So we can almost imagine the state as being strong in some dimensions, for example, strong in real estate development and slum displacement, and weak in others. For example, protecting the environment, protecting marginalized groups. And in fact, state-led informalities are central to this governance regime. Here I'm talking about not just informalities in terms of those that are facilitated through formal plans and laws, but also through informal agreement to suspend laws or tolerate violations. So I end by saying, if we are to move toward a more just way of governing, we need to critically grasp the language, politics, forms, and modalities of ambivalence through which governance is assembled and state-led informalities are produced. then only can we assemble a counter politics to reclaim the language, instantiation, and meaning of welfare and social protection for informal sector workers. Thanks so much. And I really enjoyed reading the book.
Thank you. That was so enriching.
Thank you, Lalita. Anirudh?
Thanks, Chandan. I too must say I really love reading this book. So I've been studying slums in Bangalore together with a whole group of collaborators for almost 12 years now. And I had been coming to Bangalore every year to study these slums very much in a boots on the ground, coupled with satellite image analysis approach. So I know several of these places that Supriya has written about. I mean, cement huts, her depiction of it took me right back to those 10 by 20 plots marked off by raw concrete blocks with a small raw concrete hut literally in the middle of that compound, and the rest of the compound filled with garbage of different kinds, because these are all people who make a business out of recycling garbage, just as Supriya describes in her book. So there were two other settlements you looked at, new one, Ashraya Nagar, and KS Gardens and cement huts, the old ones, which are also in our database. I've been a few times to each of these slums. So I know exactly those pictures you are painting, and you've done a wonderful job of it, Supriya. You've really brought out the lives of these people, which is very, very important, because the second big point here is that although slums are ubiquitous, you see them all around you in big cities. You just have to go one lane behind MG Road in Bangalore, and yet there's so little known about slums. The first time we had a census in slums was 2011. That's probably where the number comes from that Chandan mentioned, 540 something. But as is well known, the census has only looked at some tip of the iceberg. It's only looked at the best of slums, which do find a place in official registers. There are hundreds, thousands of slums which are not on the official register, which are newly formed, which are trying to get on registers, which are not part of the census. So that's a gross underestimate of the number of slums. We need to do much more, and Supriya's book does a great job about it. Third, the big point that she makes is that it's not a slum is not a kind of place, it's a category of places. It's very different from each other. Supriya says the new and the old, but even within each of these categories, there's a lot of variation. There's in fact a whole continuum of slums, ranging from what we call blue polygon slums, which are just 4 poles and a blue tarp stretched on top, which the newest, poorest migrants make, to at the other end, 3-story concrete structures, which are kind of indistinguishable from lower middle class regular settlements. So speaking of slums, one needs to be very precise of what kind of settlement are you talking about, because these are very different kinds of people, differently affected by formality and informality, and differently located in the economy. Again, I think Supriya does a wonderful job by going with the categories people themselves have of describing their own material status. I'm looking at page 132, 133 of the book, where she says, in the first category were households who had done well by their own category. Income ranging from 15 to 20,000, at least 2 earning members. And this is the important part to me. Typical occupations were permanent government service, regular fruit or vegetable shop, skilled labor, office assistant in private offices, organized waste collector, helper in 5-star hotel, and social worker with NGOs. So all low paid, but all formal sector. certain that they're going to get the same paycheck next month and next month and next month. The big uncertainty that's in the lives of more informal people has been taken out of their lives. And then she describes two more categories, those who are just managing and those who are very poor. And I can completely relate to everything she's writing here. These the very poor rag pickers, children of rag pickers. Then she makes another fundamentally important point, which is that there is very little upward mobility. You would think that people come to cities, and having come to cities, perhaps they don't advance, but their children, taking advantage of the resources that cities undoubtedly have, are able to make better livings for themselves in the next generation. No, Supriya doesn't find that happening. My colleagues and I don't find that happening. It's like you make some advances after coming to the city, but there's a quick plateau and you don't go beyond that. And the best these kids achieve is that they become shop assistants, they become call center operators. The young women do much better than their grandmothers. They're no longer working as maids in other people's homes, but they're working in call centers. But that's about the extent of upward mobility that living in a slum delivers. Multiple generations live in slums. These are facts our policymakers need to know much, much better. And I think Supriya does a wonderful job in bringing that out. There's also a revelation in the chapter about garment workers. That's something I read very closely because I have no background in garment workers. And there's one point here, Supriya, where it seems as if there's a government agency, perhaps in rural Odisha, which is training young women to kind of come and become conscript labor for low-paid garment sector jobs, all under the guise of the government skilling mission. Yeah. This has the whiff of scandal to it. I think you should write something about it. Three quick points. So, three quick points where I would urge Supriya to push herself a little harder. I think one of the points she's already covered, and that is the point about informality, which correctly is fundamental to her treatment of slums. I mean, that's what these places are, dens of multiple informalities. Supriya does well to focus on informal jobs, but then she also talks about informal housing, which is critical. And then in slums at the lower end of the continuum, people don't have identity papers, so the people themselves are informal. And these informalities build upon and add to one another in the sense that they add to the uncertainty and risk and vulnerability in your lives. If your job can be lost in a moment, if your house can be knocked down in a moment, and if you can be picked up for being paperless, then life assumes a whole different set of assumptions in which moving forward is very far from your imagination. Surviving from day to day becomes your principal goal. And that ties in with instances of high downward mobility and low upward mobility. So I would, not just Supriya, but all of us who work on this, I think we need to go in and unpack informality and do a better job about it. Second, and I have just one more point after this. Supriya also mentions about organizing, collectivizing, making use of the political route to improve the lot of slum residents. And there have been some studies that have looked at which slums have moved ahead of others because they have been able to organize better or because they've had better leaders. These are studies by Adam Auerbach, by Rebecca Bowers, and a couple of other people. And I think that's something else we need to figure out is how have some slum dwellers, but not others, managed to engage with democratic politics to improve their lots. That might be a useful lesson. And finally, the very last point, is I think I for one would be very curious for a study that looks at technology, because I think the way I see it moving around slums, this is also a museum of technologies of different vintages. You find ages-old blacksmiths still practicing in slums because the level of technology of other slum dwellers is of that kind. So I've been curious for long, and Bangalore being a city of technology, perhaps it would be useful for some of us to get together and do this survey of what kinds of technologies are prevalent within nooks and corners of Bangalore. That should be fun. Very last point. The broader comparative question, Supriya, that you mentioned, absolutely your study addresses those questions head on. I mean, because of a failure of rural policy broadly, people have come into towns, not just Bangalore, every town, not just metro, now even the second, third tier cities. And then after the failure of rural policy, there's a failure within cities of employment policy and housing policy. And to the extent that your study is addressing those questions, and it is addressing them head on, I think it makes a very important contribution to the larger questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anirudh. Alexandra?
Thank you. I want to first echo colleagues before me congratulating Supriya for this wonderful book, which I enjoyed reading very much, and online. And then, of course, I look forward to have the actual thing in my hands. I'm one of those people that actually like the commodity book, perhaps the commodity scholars, to actually go through chapters up and down on paper. So I learned a lot from Supriya during the years. We've been in conversation around a number of issues. I'm not an urban studies scholar. I'm a labor studies scholar who ended up a lot of time in urban areas, but it's still like labor is the entry point I have. So this to give you a sort of reader to some of the issues that I'm going to raise, which focus pretty much on the contributions of this work on labor studies. So located at the intersection of urbanization and labor informality studies, and with the wonderfully simple but very powerful question, which is what happened to the poor in a city that is rapidly growing rich. This book actually places in conversation space and labor in ways which I consider to be very progressive and very original. And it reads overall as a sort of social history of Bangalore, which is also a narrative style, which I say it's very productive and very useful for the reader. Now, the key role of land in shaping this dynamic of urban marginality, its spatial features and laboring practices take center stage in the book. And the book is very much able to represent the slums, not just as homogeneous lands where a lot of informal work takes place, which a lot of well-meaning, but perhaps rather sort of dependency theory, heavy conceptualization adopt, but also stresses the different strategic interests of different slum dwellers. They're on the basis of the different labor relations they're part of and the different locations within the city. And I think in this lens is also in conversation with some studies on dispossession around urban areas or peri-urban areas, which I found really interesting in recent times, the work of Michael Levian, of course, but also of Rana Dasgupta. So the central concept of urban marginality that is deployed here draw not just on the lens on informal labor per se, but is centered on the concept of the wage. And I find this lesson fundamental to how we can move ahead in informal studies for a number of reasons, and also for the way in which Supriya actually uses the lens of the wage, which is on the one hand as an entry point, but avoids the productivist bias that some labor scholarships, even Marxist scholarships, actually has, because while adopting a political economy approach here, I think it's very clear that this emphasis on the wage is deployed to provide a sort of reading of what the wage is, which tries to sort of deploys it as an indicator of inequality in this case, rather than as an indicator of productivity. So it is, in a sense, the outcome of processes of social devaluation of labor and the corresponding livelihoods that come from this process, as opposed to an actual sort of indicator of the type of labor that we are sort of analyzing here. So in this respect, I think it's also very much in line with the number of feminist contributions that are coming out internationally, I would say, that provide new readings of the informal economy, stressing its reproductive features. And for instance, I'm thinking about the work of Veronica Gago on Economías Populares in Argentina, and its new contribution with Lucy Caballero on a feminist reading of debt, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of productive linkages that one can draw here. So in terms of informality, I think this is read through three axes through the book. On the one hand, in the way in which it shapes vulnerability, but to a different degrees based on regulation and organization. The second is its institutional production, which is a point which many of us have stressed for a long time. So the way in which the state itself structures and reproduces informality, generally someone like me will stress to labor policies, but in this case we see how this is regenerated through urban policies as well, and housing policies. And finally, its role, its linkages with the migration, stressing very rightly so informality as a first order issue that then has implication for migration and not vice versa. And so this, to me, is like the apparatus of the book, this reading of political economy that reaches out to feminist interventions. Well, Supriya openly acknowledged the influence of intersectionality in her work, but I would say, more broadly speaking, this sensitivity to sort of the reproductive aspect of the wage and the labor relations is what I really liked from the book. And then, of course, the book draws the linkages in which informality and space and housing manifest in practice, looking at differences between different forms of settlements and slums and industrial housing. Now, I just want to stress three key points in terms of contributions, and then leave with the three questions which are, well, for Supriya, but for all of us, I would say, to sort of engage with. First, I think in terms of key contributions, I see this process of emplacement of data on informal labor relations in a specific setting, Bangalore slums in this case, as really sort of providing us with a visual map of the great differentiation of the informal sector that a lot of us write about or a lot of us read about, but this emerges very clearly in the narrative. And relatedly, I think the link between the specialization of informal activities and the evolution of informal housing then establishes a very close link between what poverty actually, working poverty is, and where working poverty is located. And I think this has connections not just with the work of Harvey, like Supriya acknowledges in the first chapter, but also with the work of other geographers like Jonas, Sharat Shari, again on India, but also others in South Africa, for instance, the work of Gillian Hart. Now, what I really think it's a great contribution here is the ability to deconstruct narratives, both mainstream narrative of the urbanization of poverty thesis that sees poverty as this thing which is carried by migrants to be plopped in the city when they arrive, and as opposed to this reading instead showing the ways in which the urban is managed produces poverty in and on itself. But also on the other hand of the spectrum, I really appreciated sort of a sympathetic but critical engagement with the work of Kanil Sanyal and the limitations also that a thesis only stressing structured exclusion actually means, because we're still not within the realm of linking these processes to accumulation, which instead I think the book stresses very much in its empirics. And finally, I would say that the ways in which the book highlights the relevance of class in understandings of informality is one where we understand the features of class as given by the incorporation into specific labor relations, but at the same time, it also provides class as a reproductive experience in the ways in which it is then lived in the actual slums or the actual housing of reference. And I think this is yet another point that I hope Supriya will sort of expand in the future, because he sets a number of linkages with reproductive debates, which, I'm sort of very sensitive to. I have three questions that I have. One relates to the link of this urban story of informal workers with the broader patterns of dispossession that we see in India. And what would be your position on that? The second question is empirical, I have to say factual. Of course, I enjoyed very much the chapter on garments, given the work I do. But I wonder there if it was a stylistic choice not to organize that chapter through the lens of space first, and then looking at the type of labor relations which characterize the sector, including the new trends, because the other chapter starts with the slums, with the type of spaces you have, and then get into the nitty-gritty of the type of labor relations. You seem to be doing the opposite there, and I wonder if there is a reason why you adopted that lens. And the final one relates to political mobilization. And of course, the question of class cannot be but left partially open in a book like this, because we do struggle to see mobilization in class terms whenever we look at informal livelihoods. But again, I would like to sort of ask Supriya if at the very least, giving, even notwithstanding the heterogeneity that we see, we can make an argument for sort of a class politics that starts from reproductive realms, and so that bridges what are classic laborist demands around wages and around contributions with instead reproductive demands around housing, around sort of property rights. And if that is really the question that we see when we get down to which type of implications a study like yours has for political mobilizations for the working poor more broadly. Thanks a lot for writing this book and for inviting me to discuss it with you today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, all the panelists, for your such engaged responses. Supriya, I'll just throw in one other question of mine, again relating to the political parties that appear in this book. You mentioned that the slum dwellers, citizens, vote differentially between assembly and parliamentary elections. And, so despite a fairly, cynical, uncaring political regime that, that you so convincingly show us, that just doesn't care to help rehabilitate the school dropouts among slum children or give them skills to help, manage for the loss of that valuable experience. Why? I mean, so there is a discernment of sorts, and I was wondering on what do you rest? I mean, how do you observe that an active response of that kind that is discriminating between parliamentary elections, state elections, and also I know that you've spent a lot of time talking with them outside of electoral politics. Was there what kind of political idealism did you find among them in terms of what is a critique of politics that you may have heard in interviews, and in terms of what would they like to rather see in place of what we have? I mean, this is if you recall this famous Boaventura the Santos, his ethnography in a Brazilian slum. In the 70s, he just came up. It was a Marxist question. He said, these guys have informal justice settlements that look like the formal justice settlements, and he felt the bourgeois, imagination of justice had exhausted their imagination, although they weren't the bourgeois. I mean, I'm not necessarily hinting. It's not that kind of a question, but in terms of even a small critique, it needn't be a theory of alternative politics. But sorry, Supriya, that was my thing, and over to you now. And
thank you. I mean, this is such a rich set of responses, and I don't have answers to all the questions which were raised. So I will actually pick a few issues that have been mentioned. Let me start with Lalita. Lalita, so yes, of course, the city as a spatial concept. And I think I have mentioned in chapter 1 that I have tried, in fact, to move away from the notion of the slum as a space which is being reproduced, maintained, redrawn, worked on, so on and so forth, and seen it more as a location where different kinds of occupations have and different policies have played themselves out. So in that sense, the whole concept of space, which I have used, is somewhat different from what is now being used in mainstream sociology and social anthropology. But I want to actually go back to the third question that you raised, which is what are the policy lessons which come out of the study? Because having written countless project reports while I was in ISEC, which are gathering dust, and project reports always gather dust. They're never taken seriously by the government. But we are, as social scientists, I think, and who do development studies, we're still left with this illusion that we may make a difference at some point in time to how policymakers think. And you'd be surprised that one of the projects which I draw on here, the migration project, was actually given to us initially by a very imaginative IAS officer who I met in ISEC, and she talked to me about my work, and she said, can you tell us what can we do for migrants? I was just so excited that a bureaucrat should ask this question with so much spontaneity and so much energy, and she gave us a lot of money to do this project. The journey of the project shows how fragile is our relationship to policy and to policymakers. We worked with 4 planning department secretaries. This woman left. There were 3 others who took her place with, variable levels of interest in policy, in migrants, so on and so forth. So, but it still remains a very important concern for me. Is there some way to impact policy? And I would say that, very broadly speaking, the first thing that comes to mind is Professor Ajit Ghosh's quote, which I have given in the conclusion, which is that we need to return to a paradigm of labor-intensive industrialization, which most countries had traversed in their path of development, and which we have kind of leapfrogged. And that's the only way to address this whole problem of employment. Having said that, of course, none of us are economists, but certainly a return to that debate in policy circles, if in any way this study can contribute to that, I would, I would think I have done a lot if the study can contribute a little bit. The other is this whole question of, can one really talk about welfare without at the same time talking about work? And the welfare paradigm really sits like a huge hegemon on all of us. And it's not just the policymakers regime, or it's not just NGOs and civil society organizations, or even slum dwellers themselves who have bought into this whole idea that welfare policies in different domains of life can somehow address their privation and their marginality. And this gets so easily sucked into regional politics, into caste politics, into many other politics of social identity, leaving the whole question of class, work, employment, livelihood completely marginalized, so to speak. So this particular question has haunted me for a long time. And if there is a way indeed to question the importance that welfare, the centrality of welfare, without questioning, or rather, let me put it this way, without questioning the centrality of welfare, in what ways can we bring work back to the paradigm of development? That I think would be, our kind of contribution to policy debates. And so when we look at policy, and of course we're looking at the state concomitantly, I think one of the most important things to recognize here is that there is so much faith being placed on the state as a generator and executor of welfare. Whereas when we're talking about the informal sector, it is actually the state as much as the private sector, which is the generator of informality. Not only through, vast numbers of contract labor, which the state employs itself, but through very studied, deliberate, and conscious efforts on the part of the state machinery to withdraw from its role as a regulatory mechanism. And we have seen this in studies of the Karnataka labor bureaucracy, for example. So in that sense, I think the point that you raised, that what are the ways in which the state's accountability in this whole question can be looked at and can be restored, I think there has to be a great deal of effort to reread the state's role in the production of informality. So I will leave it at that, Lalita, and hope to continue the conversation with you in many other domains. Anirudh, so obviously I have leaned on your work on Bangalore slums to quite a large extent, and the intergenerational lack of access to mobility, which you have talked about in your last publication on Bangalore slums, where you mentioned, where you studied grandfathers, fathers, and sons occupations, not found a great deal of difference, and where you've seen institutional factors like skills, credit, information, education, etc., as major hurdles in the way of slum dwellers, younger generations, of accessing more, sorry, my voice is going, of accessing more lucrative or more meaningful occupations. What I have done is to look at, so let me say that I'm deeply enriched by that study. But what I have done is to look at the whole question of what employment is actually available to slum dwellers. And so going back to your question about the garment workers, many of whom are also slum dwellers, what is the role that the state is playing in creating a labor force, which is part of the underprivileged class, which is exploited, first generation women workers? what actually is happening is that the state is constructing, or that the state is putting up these skill centers in backward areas or in backward states, in state capitals like Bhubaneswar, Patna, Chhattisgarh, etc., which these centers send out, their people to source young women from very poor families in rural areas, bring them to these cities for a couple of months training, and then push them to Bangalore to work in these garment factories. These skill centers in these backward states are actually state supported and state sponsored. They have fancy names like the Deen Dayal Upadhyaya scheme for skilling, for employment, so on and so forth. So it's very easy actually to see the state as a direct collaborator in the production of a new class of rural young women who will come to the cities and work as labor. And as many of us have chronicled, Alessandra's own work has chronicled, that global supply chains in these cities, particularly in apparel's export, occupy a very, very shadowy place in the city, as while they are in principle part of the organized sector or the formal sector, there is a wage board, there is provident fund, there is health insurance. But over several surveys done over many years, we have seen that 20 to 25% of these women don't get even the formally stipulated minimum wage. So it's very clear, even in this domain, to see the state as a direct collaborator in the production of a class, here a production of a class of young women laborers, to whom very little is available really in terms of mobilization, in terms of collective action, in terms of thinking even of leaving a particular kind of job and moving to other kinds of employments because they are young migrants. So the whole question of informality, which you have looked at in terms of in institutional terms, then appears as part of the labor capital relationship, particularly when we look at the garment sector. And within slums, of course, what you've pointed to as institutional features of deprivation, those are really important to look at. And I think, I've also done that in my work. The whole question of democratic politics, which we have all been engaged with in some sense or the other. Slums in many parts of the country are, sucked into democratic politics in different ways. For example, if you looked at the situation in West Bengal, during the long years of the left coalition's rule of 33 years, the penetration of the party in power into slums was so close, and the sort of the monitoring and invigilation of slum lives by the political party was so intense. But at the same time, what the question that is raised is, why didn't this very close engagement lead to more effective policies and implementation of policies in terms of slum redevelopment, rehabilitation, renewal of the urban poor situation, so on and so forth. In Bangalore, we see a very different kind of a situation where the political party system operates very differently at different levels of politics. So we actually have in the wards, which I have discussed in a particular constituency, we actually have different sets of political parties which have been elected at the council, the assembly, and the parliamentary levels over the last 20 to 30 years. This has led to a certain fragmentation of political parties as, in terms of programs and in terms of implementation of programs, but it also shows that neither slum dwellers, nor slum committees, nor the caste associations, which are politically active within the slums, have a clearly articulated vision of what slum development might mean in this context. And so the fragmented politics which we see in terms of different political parties coming into play at different times and at different levels, to a certain extent reflects the lack of political mobilization and the lack of political awareness as far as this population is concerned. Alessandra, coming to the three questions that you raised, and I'm really grateful for the, your discussion of the labor question in the context of this book, because one of the main attempts that was made in this book was to bring the urban question and the labor question into a particular format. And what are the ways in which we study cities also reflect on the ways in which we study labor. So thanks, therefore, for contextualizing the study in labor studies.
Supriya, if I may just interject for a quick second, we have 20 minutes left for the whole thing to end. We need time for the audience to ask its questions. Some of them have been typing in questions, but please finish.
So Alessandra and I have a continuing conversation in many domains. So why did I look at garments? Why did I not look at garments as space, and why did I start from as workers? For precisely the same question, that I wanted to bring the labor question into prominence and centrality into the study. And also because we are actually forced, when we're looking at garment workers, we are actually forced to look at spaces, to go into the neighborhoods where they live, rather than to go into the factories. So it was, in a sense, a kind of engagement with that issue, that I wanted to engage with garment workers as workers, rather than as citizens living in a particular neighborhood. So that was part of it. The other broader question which you raised, and which obviously I don't have time to discuss it here, but what are the ways in which we can actually use class as a dimension of collective action where informal workers are concerned? And we both engaged with Kalyan Sanyal, but my attempt in this book, deeply indebted to Sanyal for his work, but my attempt in this book, to a certain extent, was to go beyond his whole conception of the structural exclusion that happens to labor, and he saw this only in petty commodity production, and to some extent to bring back wage work to the centrality of the discourse on what should happen to workers. Because I felt that given the diversity of wage work that we are confronted with over formal, informal, and within informal, there is a huge amount of diversity and heterogeneity in the way in which the wage relationship actually manifests itself in late capitalism. For those reasons, wage has, to a certain extent, receded into the shadows when we talk about collective organization of workers. So part of my mandate here was really to bring it back and to show in what ways we still can retain wage as an important component of thinking about the politics of informal workers. I will stop here. Chandan, I don't think I have time to go to your questions. So
no, we'll just see what the audience has to ask, and then see if there's time. Thank you, Supriya. Thank you all. There might be time for us to reconvene to talk amongst ourselves. Let's see. There's a question here by Gunjan Chauhan. How do you see the Smart City project as a redevelopment initiative in response to the urban poverty, slums, and other modes of existence? And there's another question by Lalita Chandrasekhar. What is the role of education in a slum? Does it reinforce the stratification system in society, or does it facilitate social mobility? Yes, these are two questions as of now. And there's another question that that wishes that the discussion was not as academic as it's turned out to be. But That's not a question, really. Yeah.
Smart cities. Smart cities are in the vision of the government, technologically inspired and technologically informed. As you would know, Bangalore lost out in the competition for funding for the smart city paradigm. But I have to admit that I don't know a lot or a great deal about the smart city because it really didn't interest me to a great extent. It makes so little sense to, even as a policy, to be talking about smart cities, technology, so on and so forth, when the largest number of cities and small towns are stagnating on many different dimensions, and without attention, which we've been talking about today for a long time, and which my book chronicles, and without attention to those kinds of issues. Without attention, for example, to primary education, to be talking about technology doesn't make a great deal of sense to me. I will leave it at that. Lalita's question on education, whether it leads to more stratification or mobility. We found a large number of dropouts in the slums. We also found a large number of young people who did not see education as a vehicle to social mobility because it was just not part of their imagination as it is part of the imagination of the middle class. They did not see the value of education in the way in which the middle class does. And therefore, education which is very middle class inspired, the kind of education which is offered in schools, on the one hand, remains out of reach for these children, for these youth, even when they're going to school, because much of it is maybe in English, even when it is in Kannada. It's not really accessible in terms of the environments in which they live, in terms of their lack of access to books, to other resources of education broadly defined. That's one thing. The other thing is that, as I said, the drive and the ambition which keeps a middle class boy or a girl in school drives them to, towards great competition, etc., to achieve. That is something which we saw was completely lacking. So while we focused on dropouts and while we looked at the ways in which youth kind of fell off the edge in class 8, in class 10, or in class 12, we also looked at the ways in which the system, the broader system, the system of education, the system of skills, the system of employment, etc., none of these actually work towards pushing slum youth to attain more education. So yes, it is an instrument of mobility. Of course, someone who has done class 12 and has taken a course in computers will get a job as an office assistant. Someone who has not, who has dropped off in class 8 will probably take to domestic service or, very, very low income occupations. So of course it makes a difference to mobility in that sense, but there has been no sustained state intervention to bring slum youth or slum children out into the arena of mainstream education.
Supriya, thank you. There's another question. Shailajit Sen Gupta asks, many of the migrant slum dwellers do not have voting rights as they're not the domicile of the city. How does urban development authorities think about their welfare as there's no direct benefits fetched from them by way of votes?
But that's precisely the argument in my chapter on peripheral slums, which are migrant slums, that because they don't exercise their voting rights in the city and they have to go back to the village in order to vote, they are not a meaningful constituency for local political leaders. And so the relationship between local political leaders and these peripheral slums is very fragile, is very sort of unreal. There might be a crisis, a great water crisis or a great crisis of eviction, which might attract the attention of local politicians, but there is no sustained bridges between the local council or the assembly, locally elected assembly politician and the slums. Precisely for the reason that you have pointed to, that they don't have voting rights in the city.
There are two questions. One is a broad one. What are the effects of slums, I suppose, on urban politics? How do slums impact urban politics is one. And another question by Jeevan Kumar. Do we also need to look at the model of development that continues to promote rural-urban migration, which results in slum proliferation?
The impact of slums on urban politics? I think Anirudh would be much better positioned to answer that question. Anirudh, do you want to take that question?
Nice punch, Supriya. You passed the difficult question on to me. But, before answering that question, I want to go back and take issue with you a little bit, just a little bit, in the response you gave to the question about education and social mobility. I think one big reason that people are not getting educated to a point where it actually makes a difference is because there are few people in the past in slums who have achieved that level and thereby serve as role models to others. Those role models don't exist in slums. So even though these are slums right in the heart of Bangalore, I have not seen a kid studying to become a software engineer or a doctor, anything like that. And then because nobody has become, it becomes sort of a vicious cycle. The parents say, ki, पढ़ लिख के क्या doctor थोड़ी बन जाएगा. So then what's the point of education? Because no one has achieved anything in the past. So there are some NGOs, even in Bangalore, who are doing some excellent work in trying to get people out of this vicious cycle. But in any case, I just wanted to add that to your point. The second point, the question you do want me to answer, I mean, let's look at it this way. Why are there slums in a city? It's because, upper middle class and richer people need cheap maids, cheap gardeners, cheap security guards, cheap drivers, cheap vegetable vendors. We do need all of them, but we never think about where these people are going to live with the kinds of money that they make or that we pay them. And so slums come up because the people in the slums are essential to certain parts of the economy of the city. Several of these slums, the new ones, the very, very new ones, don't have voter cards in the city, so they don't matter. But the rest of the slums, or even the new ones, as they try and get into the machinery of the BBMP or KSTB or whatever agency is involved in formalizing the slum, it's a long, long dance over several years that's played out between a political agent, who's usually an MLA candidate or an MLA, and the slum dwellers and the official agency. So the political guy becomes the kind of a middle person between the slum dwellers and the Sarkari agency, and gets vote from this voting block multiple times before this slum actually gets its official papers. The first step, of course, is to get these people their voter IDs. So that's really the first step in the slum's development. The politician is involved at every stage. It's a give and take relationship. I hope that answers your question a little bit. Thank you.
Yes, and absolutely. I couldn't have put it better. Perhaps I would just add to this whole question of slum politics that in the current context, the whole, real estate plays a huge role in defining slum politics, because interest in urban land, particularly slum land, from large real estate mafias, I mean, I'm sorry to use the word, is very clear, and the ways in which the politics of political parties and the politics of real estate have kind of intermingled in the city is also very clear. So there is, in fact, no way in which to separate out local politics of slums from the politics of real estate in the city.
Supriya, now we have 3 more questions. There was Jeevan's question. I'm not sure if you addressed that about, do we need to rethink the models of development that promote?
Yes, Jeevan Kumar's question. Yeah. So, yes, I would like to answer that. Jeevan Kumar, obviously, to the extent that a large number of the urban poor are rural migrants, obviously the lens must turn to rural development. And I have addressed a number of debates in the literature on why is it that a large number of people remain confined to agriculture? I mean, agriculture still is the largest employer in the Indian economy, although that's changing to some extent. Why is it that a large number of people remain tied to agriculture in a context where agriculture's share in the GDP is reducing, naturally, declining? And part of the answer is that the kind of employment that is available in urban areas, particularly in large cities, which are all now technologically, driven, that the kind of employment that is available now in these kinds of cities is not accessible to rural people, and therefore the attraction of the city is much less, and the pull of the city is absolutely for those who live at a subsistence level, who come to the city more as subsistence earners, which Barbara Harris-White has actually put it really well when she said that the transition is not from subsistence to surplus, but the transition is actually from one kind of subsistence to another kind of subsistence. So the policy attention obviously must turn to avenues of rural employment, partly also to rural non-farm employment, which has floundered in the country as a whole, and particularly also in Karnataka. But beyond that, I would say that this whole question of the development of small towns and smaller cities has also been largely ignored in Karnataka, as in other parts of the country. And in Karnataka, we find that urbanization has actually happened in the 3 main corridors, 3 main transport corridors: Bangalore, Mysore, Mangalore, Karwar, and I'm forgetting which is the third. And about 60% of the urban population in Bangalore is actually concentrated in Bangalore district, which shows the narrowness of urban growth, and also to a certain extent reflects on the ways in which the development or the dynamism, the kind of development and dynamism which leads to the growth of small cities and small towns has just not happened. So you have, on the one hand, these epicenters of growth like Bangalore. On the other hand, you have smaller cities and smaller towns which stagnate and which flounder on the lack of investment, lack of civic development, lack of employment opportunities, so on and so forth. So obviously, these are some of the questions which must be addressed and answered by public policy, but there's very little attention at the moment to these kinds of questions.
Supriya, we can end 5 minutes later than scheduled. So there are 3 big questions. The first one is by Aparna, which I don't know how I had overlooked earlier. Aparna Sundar.
Okay.
She asks, can you elaborate what a politics of the informal that centered the wage would look like? Relatedly, is the return to a development model focused on labor-intensive manufacturing realistic and even desirable, given both the technological transformations of the global economy and the extractive and environmental costs of such industrialization? That's Aparna's question. Shall I read out the other 2 so that you can take them all at once, or Shall I wait till you finish?
No. I'll answer Aparna's question. Aparna, nice to have you here. And yes, the wage question is indeed central to the book, actually, or it comes only in the conclusion. The way I have looked at it is, of course, the informal sector is hugely fragmented, hugely diverse in terms of its of the kinds of wage relationship that it has with capital, or even with the state. But there is a sense in which we need to bring back wage into the question of, into the political economy question, both of development and of collective mobilization, for the following reasons: that if we are looking at the large number of self-employed persons and the whole domain of petty commodity production, it doesn't really, this is a great thesis that Kalyan Sanyal came up with, that petty commodity production is the result of, larger capitalist arrangements in neo-colonial systems, so on and so forth. But petty commodity production doesn't really give us an arena of conflict, of actual conflicts with which to work on, which the wage relationship does. And very quickly, to answer your question, there are large swathes of labor, both in manufacturing and in the services sector now, which have a commonality in terms of the wage relationship to their employers, which is, absence of a contract, no stipulated minimum wage, no security of tenure, so on and so forth. So those could probably provide a forum of thinking about wage as a mechanism of unified action. That's my sort of very quick answer to your question.
There's a question.
What was the second question?
There are two more questions, and after we won't take any more after this.
Okay.
They've been up for a while, so I think they have to be heard. Sujit Kumar asks, there are two questions. Do you believe that the tilt in favor of big capital in political economy framework has reduced the relative autonomy of the state to engage the urban slum dwellers in the bargaining and negotiation model typical of the political society framework? Does the dominance of capital reduce the bargaining power or the space for bargaining by the slum dwellers? Is the first question. The second question is, do you envision that under the welfare state model, the urban planning can address the issue of slum dwellers in right to the city framework? Again, I think it's a variation of the first question. Not really. I mean, it's looking at dominance of capital and the dominance of the welfare state model in dictating the terms of political bargaining of the slum dwellers. And Matthew has a question. I'll read this out now, so we're running out of time. Matthew Edicula. I wanted to check in what ways did you find the residents of these settlements engaging the state? Is it through largely informal arrangements, through political intermediaries? Did you find that different classes of slum residents engage through different techniques? Did you find anything different from the existing literature on this topic?
Good question. Let me start with Sujit's first question, which is on the welfare state. Sujit, so the welfare state has come up with a plethora of laws, with all under the sort of the rights paradigm as far as the urban poor are concerned, or as far as slum dwellers are concerned. I'm not sure if the question, as you put it, is the autonomy of the state is compromised because of the growth of capital, etc. Because we have not seen the state as beyond a plethora of welfare legislation. We have not seen much of proactiveness on the part of the state to take care of the urban poor. And one particular or very prominent example is the Construction Workers Welfare Board, where the government charges a cess to builders and is supposed to use this 1% of cess that it gets from builders to contribute to construction workers' welfare. Both the legislation and the execution of this legislation, as we all know, is highly flawed. So I wouldn't approach it in the sense of the state is compromised and the state is disabled by capital's greater power. But I think we need, as you know, the discussion with Lalita also emphasized, we need more clear lens with which to unravel the ways in which the state itself relates to informal workers beyond this whole question of welfare, etc. I'd like to go to the question of how the poor engage the state, and do different sections of slum communities engage the state in different ways. Slum communities engage the state directly, actually only in periods of episodic crisis. For example, if there's a water crisis, for example, if there is eviction-related crisis, or any other crisis. There isn't a systematic set of relations between political authorities, local, state, or central, and the slum communities on the other hand. However, your question is important to the extent that we can reframe it as, why is there so little of substantive connection between slums and the state, or between slums and politicians? And to a certain extent, we've answered that, saying that where the peripheral slums are concerned, they are not substantive voters. But the interesting question is, why is there a set of slums in the cities, in inner city neighborhoods, where you would expect a second and third generation set of slum dwellers to have a much more proactive set of aggressive, assertive set of political connections with the state? Much of it is mediated by NGOs and civil society organizations who have worked on slums in terms of particular and different kinds of issues. It could be education, it could be water, it could be sanitation, etc., etc. This whole paradigm with which NGOs have worked and into which political leaders as well as slum dwellers have kind of, collaborated, has in a sense truncated or divided the slum dweller as a consumer rather than as a worker, and as a consumer of different kinds of goods. It could be education, it could be health, it could be sanitation, it could be so many things. But the whole question of why the urban poor, or what is the locus of urban power, which keeps slum dwellers at particular low levels of occupations, incomes, and access to civic amenities. This question has never really been addressed or answered in the course of these interactions between slum dwellers and politicians, mediated by NGOs, civil society organizations, so on and so forth. I don't know if I answer your question partially, at least.
Thank you. Thank you, Supriya. Thank you, all the panelists. It was a terrific discussion, and can't thank you all enough for making time to be here. And thank you to the BIC audience and the institution for hosting this. Supriya mentioned at some point that the relationship between academics and policymakers is a fragile one. And I hope this book makes it a little more solid, or a little less fragile, and just animates the imagination, the public imagination at some point. And the conversation here, I hope, will have added to that effort, and also to the research imagination. Thank you all again.
Thank you, Chandan. Thank you, Supriya.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Supriya.
This is really